Hey, Jess. Hey, Dr. Bajor. I'm giving you a host.
Hi, Sheila. Hi, Jessica.
I'm a behind the scenes kind of person, so let me give you the host.
I have my classroom background.
So cute.
You don't want to see my house, believe me. Jess, we can't hear you.
You're muted, Jess.
Okay, good.
That's better.
No, I was commiserating.
She did most of her dissertation work by Excel. So I would really like her to kind of explain some of the benefits that she sees kind of each way and some of the different features that she notices in vivo after playing around that maybe can enhance or possibly hold her back from doing the work that she needs to do from something like Excel. And like I said, then we'll spend some time in breakout rooms to where Dr. Bajor and I and we could kind of split things up. So we'll be cycling through those rooms. Dr. Bajor has a lot of experience using this as well as doing qualitative research without qualitative software. And so do I. I probably have a little bit more recent expertise with in vivo, but clearly not as much as some of you will if you've used the new versions. So forgive us, both Dr. Bajor and me, for any rustiness that we have on where the buttons are. They change all the time, just like Microsoft Word. I can't even figure out how to bold things sometimes in Microsoft Word. So we'll walk through what we have. And then if you have any questions, of course, feel free to stop us along the way and we will get in there. And again, Sheila and Jessica, thank you so much for putting these together. You can help us kind of move things along. And also, if you don't mind being available to answer questions in the chat box, as well as to help us navigate questions that might be taking us a little bit off the pathway that we're going and come back to them later on. So that would be helpful. All right.
Yes.
So
yes, sounds good.
Cool. Thanks. Okay, so that's where we're going to go tonight. I guess with that being said, it is now what, 6:35, so it's a good time to start. What do you think is going to be the most beneficial, Jessica and Sheila? Where would you like us to start?
I think it might be helpful if we maybe open up the conversation to people who are able to download and try in vivo, perhaps get some perspective on what the experience was like, how did it feel, and maybe that can move forward some of the conversation in terms of what those initial sort of delving ins were like for people.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
Has anyone tried it? Has anyone downloaded it and looked at it and tried it? Any features?
Hello.
Hi,
Can everybody hear me? Hi.
No.
Yes, I've been playing around with it. I've got the free trial and I've got some codes that I developed. And then I also did the, the queries. I mean, I'm trying to see what it can do for me and not what I have to teach it to do. And I can see that there's a learning curve, number one, for me. It seems a lot easier than the Max QDA. I have to say it's a little more intuitive, but I have to program it. So I did like, the text, frequency, but it had like 1,000 its then. So it wasn't even really getting into, so it's just, I need to figure out how to use this. And Priscilla and I were talking how we're doing it by hand right now with felt tips, so that I have to be convinced that this is going to be something that's going to save me time and produce better data in the end. And I'm not convinced yet. So I'm really eager to learn how to do this.
Yeah, good. Michelle, one of the things I think was interesting is that you said produce data in the end. And I think this is one of the key points of qualitative research, right? Is that nothing is actually really data until you're doing the analysis and turning it in there. And I think that's an important thing to put in mind, is that it's not always that raw data that becomes important. It's kind of that transformation of throughout the whole qualitative process. And not that I'm trying to convince anybody to use this, because I don't think it's for everybody, nor for every research project. One of the nice things is that years down the line, the analysis and all the steps of analysis that you do is much easier when it's saved in a file rather than in like piles and piles of, you know, books and notes. And that's just something to keep in mind, is that when you go 3 years down the line to write a research article, and retransforming that raw data into the research article and what you're using, you might be asking different questions or reorganizing it differently, which is then what it was intended initially. And that's something that in the qualitative software is a little bit easier. So you also want to think about kind of forward thinking. The more work that you put in on the front end with the software, the kind of longer you're going to be able to kind of query that and use it later on. With that being said, I would have loved to show you all my dissertation data in Vivo. Unfortunately, it was in the NVivo 9, and I've been waiting for QSR to get back to me on trying to fix it, but they have not responded to me. So I'm going to be using the kind of data that they provided, that NVivo provides for the practice stuff, to show you some of these things. And I think, Michelle, this will be where you, as well as everyone else on this call, should tell us, this is what I'm trying to do. This is what's in my mind. How can I do it, right? So these text searches and finding its and ums is not great. So let's figure out what you're trying to do with that, and then we can play with some of the features to figure out how can that be done.
Well, I can throw out some themes that I've come up with in my codes. So adaptability, connection, efficacy, empathy, partnership so far. And I've got 5 in-depth interviews. So I've got like so many pages of text, of transcriptions. So now I'm trying to find, where to grab this stuff and put it in the themes. And they're there because they jump out at me as I read the transcription. But now I just have to figure out how to do it.
Sure. Yeah. In the breakout rooms, or if you prefer us to stay together, maybe in about 20 minutes or so, once we've gotten through this initial questions and demos, let's see if we can share your screen and walk through some of it.
Okay. I'll mute myself, but thank you, everybody.
No, don't.
Oh, don't?
Well, you can if you want to. That's up to you. All right, great. Anybody else try it, and how are you feeling? And I know, Shirley, welcome back. I know you had some experience with it.
Yes, I tried NVivo for several times, and now I appreciate that last time Dr. Bajor and you give us some links about qualitative research, and I watched the videos, and I get one very helpful. It told me how to create themes from the original codes and nodes. So it's very helpful, and it has solved me one big problem. Yeah, and thank you very much. And the other one I'm thinking now is I want to, last time I said, I create one about self-efficacy and one about cultural responsive teaching, So I want to put them together, but I don't know how to do that. That's another big question. Yeah.
Yeah, we'll walk through some of those things. I think again, if it gets to the point where we need to share screens, we could definitely do that. But we'll walk through the kind of demo version in a few minutes here. Anybody else have any kind of aha moments, questions that arose when you were playing around this past week?
Priscilla, you said you used it. How did you find it? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I used it like a year ago. It was for one of our, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It was for one of our statistics classes, or mixed methods maybe, where we were assigned to look up like one of I think there were like 3 different ones that we were supposed to look at. So I created a free trial of it, and my experience, I mean, I only played around with it for like an hour that day, and then I wrote up my response for our discussion board that week. And I liked the potential that I think it had, but I didn't really get too deep into it. I didn't really have any meaningful data to input. So like listening to what Michelle was talking about, I can kind of see maybe how that would be the case, like trying to input, trying to seek out those specific words, key terms that the, you know, from the participants from the interviews, because with the minimal experience I had with it, I couldn't quite figure out how to get that done. And so that's also what I'm curious about, because like Michelle said, I'm also kind of just doing color coding, and I have a really cute set of markers that I've been using that makes it fun, but it's so time consuming.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's it's not just a learning curve. There's actually I think a lot more prep work that has to go into using the qualitative software, partially just because it's just like, first of all, let's be real. These programs were not created by literacy people. They were created by a bunch of computer engineers. So we're like, oh, this makes a lot of sense to me. And that's not how a lot of us think. So we have to sometimes back up a little bit, put ourselves into that kind of computer engineering mindset, because that's really how these are kind of organized. With that in mind, once you kind of get a few of the key points and know where things are, your creativity is can flourish within the parameters of computer engineers. I would rather just have a big whiteboard and write all over it. That's not really what this is. This is lined paper with a margin on the side, and we have to work within that. So, you know, with that being said, Sheila, Jessica, what do you think might be helpful now? Do you want me to walk through kind of the sample projects? I know, Jessica, you had mentioned that might be the best thing to use at this point.
Yes, please.
Yeah, and one of the benefits of the sample projects is that it included a lot of different documents. So I was unaware that you could put so many different kinds of documents into this platform, such as pictures and other PDFs, to keep everything sort of accessible in one place. So the sample project that I personally perused had all of that. Now, the topic wasn't something that I was familiar with at all, but I think it gave a good overview of just the capabilities of the program.
Sure. So what I'm going to use is, this is called Memo. Well, I don't know if this is the name of it. This is how it saved on my computer, but Memo Practice. It looks like this is doing some research on different townships and, I don't know, environmental stuff. So as Jessica said, it's not really our area specifically, but the thing I like about this project, and I was going to use mine, and then Jessica tipped me off to this one, and I was like, oh, that sounds better actually, because of the different things that you can include in here. So in this in vivo project, the first thing that I'm going to show you is just, we'll go to the home screen, and over here in the data side, we have all these different data files. Some of these are internal. That means it's probably saved within in vivo itself. So if you import, like we did last week, some documents, it's going to be imported into this section called files. You can also have external links which link outside, right? It could be a web page or something like that. And you can't see my computer screen, but the document tab keeps bumping up because it's trying to pull data from a different file on my computer. It's external to in vivo. That would be helpful on a very large project where you might have massive files that if you all save it together with in vivo, it gets kind of bulky and frustrating to work with. So within the data files, we have things like pictures, right? So here's a picture that's actually uploaded. So for those of you that are doing qualitative observations, maybe, right? You're maybe watching a classroom or something like that. You're taking field notes, of course, but maybe you need to snap some pictures of what's on the word walls. So if you're looking at literacy and kind of contextualize or decontextualize literacy, maybe word walls in a classroom is something beneficial. You can upload the picture, and then you start to actually describe and upload that picture on the different regions. So you can kind of see, this is the description of the picture that they have in here. Obviously, NVivo's not going to do that for you, right? NVivo can't take this picture and all of a sudden say, oh, this is a large waterfront homes. But this is what they're doing, right? They selected this and they decided to, add information over here. So what we have is a description of what's in this picture. Again, that's all stuff you would have to do anyway. It's just here a very formalized way. This looks like it's uploaded into almost like an Excel sheet. You can read through the top. It's going to look very much like you would see in an Excel. Nothing too surprising here, but you can imagine importing a survey or importing some type of document. Just showing you what in vivo tools look like. Most of you are going to use things like this, which are going to be interviews. So let's look at Charles' interview. You can see this is pretty much written out like you would expect some type of interview to look like, right? In vivo, you don't even need to just include that, though. You can actually do the transcript inside in vivo. So especially if you pay extra for the transcription services, you can actually do the transcription here, and you can have the video running, so you can actually be looking at the video while looking at the transcript itself. So there's 1,000 different ways you can do transcripts. You can add the audio files right in here, or you can just, add the transcript as a whole, kind of going down the side. It doesn't really matter. It's just the text. So far, is that making sense? Kind of what you've seen? All right. Some people include PDF files, and there's also news articles. You could do social media surveys, stuff like that in here. That's just how it's going to end up looking. So for those of you who haven't tried it yet, this is what it looks like. I don't want to spend too much time here because we talked briefly about uploading it last week. The majority of you are going to be using text files that look like this. They're interviews, they're observational notes, so on and so forth. You might use some PDF files of that, but for the most part, this is what we're going to be looking at. So this is what we'll be playing around with today. Most of you have had a chance to do some coding. We talked briefly last week about making codes. It's very easy to create one. So maybe you want to highlight something and say, I was in college and teaching, and we want to make a code about this. And we're going to call this maybe background, right? So it's going to automatically create a code background. It just pops it right back up to here. And we can go through the whole thing, and now we can start dragging and dropping. So let's see. I'm just going to highlight this other part here, I guess, and I'm just going to drag and drop it just so you can see how easy it is to drag and drop it. Some of you have already played around with that, so you can kind of see how that is. What that's doing is showing us here, and let me shrink this side for you if I can. All right, never mind. What this is going to show us is for each of these codes, how many files it's coded in and how many references it's coded in. So the nice thing here is that as we go through Susan, and then we want to go through Charles, right? We take this, we're going to drop Charles also into this background. It's adding not only the file that it's included in, but also the reference. So it's really easy now for us to kind of pull up. I want to know every instance in my data set that we talk about background. Obviously, you have to do all this work yourself. Those felt tip pens are still going to work because you have to go through each of these interviews, and you have to actually drag and drop them over here. Now, if we're doing something, what we might want to do is say, background is a little bit too broad, right? We don't want to start there yet. What we want to start with is with jobs. Instead, what we might do is we might code this as jobs. And we might go back to Ken, and we might say, does Ken say what his job is here? He doesn't. What about Helen? Helen doesn't. Let's say Susan, we know she said that she was a teacher. And we're going to put that over here into jobs. Now what we're going to do is we're going to take jobs and we're going to say, you know what, that's part of background. So we're going to take this whole code right here and we're going to bring it up to background. It's going to reorganize it, right? And so now what we could do is we could drop down and it's going to give us all of those job instances. Now, this isn't the best example simply because I coded both of these as background and jobs, but you know, let's say I wanted to talk about family and I wanted to add another code for family, granny's house. Code family, it's going to pop up over here. I have that one code. Family is part of background. I'm going to move background up in, or move it up into background. Now I have one for family, two for jobs, right? So it's giving me every file and every reference. You can actually, by going to get information about background, what I can tell it to do is aggregate the coding from the child nodes. So that's going to give us all of the information for all of the codes that come under background. And this is where thematic analysis becomes important. So I'm going to show you that in a second on one that's already pre-programmed. But I'm going to go to done. And now what background is going to do is calculate 6 different references. It's calculating the 3 from here, the 1 from family, the 2 from jobs, and then the 3 that I coded just as background. So it automatically is adding it up. So once you start to create those low-level codes and you start to move those into broader themes, as long as you're aggregating it, you can show how many references are hitting a certain theme, how many files are hitting a certain theme, right? All because you've done that low-level coding and dragged and dropped into the themes. And that's going to be different than using the kind of by the hand method, because if you do it by the hand method, you have to kind of keep track of each of those instances and kind of either put them in something like an Excel sheet, as I know Jessica has done, or some other way to tabulate it. This is doing that tabulation for you. So if we click on something like economy, you'll see that economy has agriculture, fishing, jobs, tourism. All of these are going to be aggregated. It's telling you that if we take this as a theme economy, we have 24 different files that show us something about economy. If it's aggregated, I don't actually know if it's aggregated. Yeah, it is aggregated. Within economy, out of all of that, only 8 of those sources talk about agriculture. Out of the 302 codes that talk about economy as a theme, only 20 instances are actually about agriculture. So this is an easy way for you to kind of start to look and figure out, okay, what's my data really talking about? What is it speaking to, right? There's a lot here about economy. We know that's a big theme. There's 302 different references, but obviously we have more references about fish than we do agriculture. So that starts to tell us something about our data, right? Something about that theme. That theme is comprised of a whole bunch of different parts, but you know, it's just equally distributed. What we could do, so I'm going to kind of get rid of some of these data points up here. I'm just going to keep Susan's up for later. I'm going to click on economy now. What this is going to show me is every instance that we see economy being talked about. And we get some, you know, we do get to kind of show a little bit about how we want this to be displayed. But the way this is doing this is giving us the source and how many references within that source are coded as economy. Let's go down to the next source. The externals, this is core sound. If we look at that source, 3 references are coded as economy. So this is that part that was highlighted. Remember how it was dragging and dropping? This right here is exactly what was dragged and dropped. So in this particular source, this whole chunk here was one instance that was under economy. So we could go through all of our 302 instances that we coded something as economy and pull them up right away. So what that means,
Excuse me, Dr. Joe.
yes.
May I ask a question?
Sure.
Yeah. What does coverage here mean? Because I see that different percentage, you know.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'm going to pull up an example that's not external so I can show you in
okay,
just a
thank
second.
you.
Yeah, this can be a really helpful tool to use. So anyway, so the nice thing is that if you get to the point where you're like, you know what, I have 3 themes in my dissertation. Theme 1 is economy. You can pull up all 300 instances immediately, right? And this is the stuff that you will use to actually write in your dissertation. Obviously not all 302 codes, but you'll explain, I have sub-themes. Economy is made up of agriculture. I need to find those examples. I'm going to click on agriculture. And that's going to pull you to all of those instances, not of economy as a whole, but of agriculture specifically. Now, when we go to Barbara's interview, there are 4 references about agriculture, right? So I'm going to click on this. It's going to bring you right to Barbara's interview. And it's going to show us all the things that are highlighted as dealing with agriculture. So this is what Barbara is saying. She has some stuff here about agriculture that she's talking about. When you coded this, you were like, you know what? This whole thing Barbara's saying is agriculture. When we look back, it's saying that there's 4 references that take up 9.18% coverage. What that means is that roughly, if we go through the entire text, about 10% of the text is coded as agriculture. So there's another big chunk, and somewhere up here, there's another chunk, right? It's basically 10% of this specific resource is coded as agriculture. And then what we have here is, this is reference number 1 to 2. So probably what they did is like coded part 1 here, you know, and then they moved that over, and then they said part 2 and they moved that over. And so the way NVivo is doing it is just pushing those together. But anyway, this right here represents 5% of the entire interview. This is another 4% of the entire interview. Altogether, that's about 9% of the interview is coded for agriculture. Now, you know, we might not be interested just in agriculture, but we might want to know what Barbara says. So a couple of things that we could do here is look for highlights of all codes, and we could see everything that was coded. In this case, it's not so helpful. It looks like we coded a lot of what Barbara had to say, but what we might want to know is, let's look at all the different codes in this interview. Now what we can do is we can kind of pull up for Barbara every code that's represented in here. So this gives us an idea of each of the data sets. Here's all the codes listed. To me, this is really annoying to look at. So let's look at these stripes and let's pick selected items only. And we're going to click on, we want to know about the economy. We just want to know about the economy, economic stuff, right? So we're going to click on all this economy, right? We're going to select it. This is going to show us where at in this data set. Let me turn this off. She's talking about anything having to do with economy. So here she's talking about fishing and economy. We don't really see her talking about jobs is down here, along with fishing and economy. So that means that this was coded 3 times. And you can see from this coding density that this is black codes. What that means is that this was coded very densely. That means that there's some interaction between these different codes. Obviously, economy is going to be coded anytime these other 2, because this is the parent node and these are the aggregates, or it's aggregated into it. But we can kind of see, okay, jobs and cost of living and fishing, that's all connected in this particular piece. Jobs is here, agriculture is here. We could see all of those things are somewhere coded here in the text. And so what that tells us is, all right, obviously all of this stuff was coded here. This might be a very important piece of text to look at. And that's how we might choose which samples to pick when we're writing up qualitative information, right? So this is just an example of how I use coding strips, which I think is probably one of my favorite features in NVivo, because it's something that by hand isn't clearly or isn't as easily visualized. Especially when I might say I want to look at, I'm going to look at economy alone. I'm not going to look at these, I only want to look at economy, but I also want to kind of also look at how that's related to one of our other big codes, which is nature and environment and policy and management. Let's throw in real estate as well. All right, now what we can do is look at what Barbara is saying. And we're starting to go down without rereading it again. And we're starting to see, okay, she's talking about the environment and the economy. Those two come pretty close. So there might be some interaction between those two codes here. Here she's talking about real estate development and natural development. Something's really interesting going on at that point. Let me go back and look at that again. This is showing me that something Barbara is saying is playing with these two major themes that I have. This is, again, all done based on your kind of eyeballing it. Very similar to if you were to go through and highlight everything by hand. You have to do this first by hand or in the computer. You have to tell the computer what to do. This is just helping you keep track of that and visualize it. And for me, it's very nice and clean to be able to scroll down any of these interviews and get a quick sense of what your major themes are or of what your specific code is. You'll be able to pull it up. All right. So again, those are kind of the basics of what some of these codes and what coding might look like in here. Before I move on to kind of maybe a next step analysis, do you have any questions about so far what I've shown you? No? All right, so there's a couple of other tools here that I think are really beneficial for kind of just understanding your data set. The Explore tab is something that I think is like extremely beneficial and helpful. One of the things that's pretty helpful is this hierarchy chart. What I'm going to do is click it for all codes. So I'm just basically saying I want to compare all codes here, but you could also click on just the ones you're interested in if that was important to you. For me, I'm clicking all of my code just because I want to get a representation of how everything relates. This is just a very quick eyeballing it, easy way to look at how all of your different codes are connected to each other. You could, of course, blow this up and show it in a different way, but what we have is we know that in the economy, fishing or aquaculture is the most, is kind of the biggest subcategory. Fishing is a little bit smaller. And then we have the things that we're looking at, jobs and cost of living, agriculture and tourism. And it's giving you all those numbers exist here, right? So it's a really easy way to be able to get a visual representation of your data by saying, how is my data represented? This is just a tool for you to use as a researcher to kind of get an idea of what are the big ideas that I'm coming across. And so when you get down to all these really tiny things down here, sometimes it's beneficial for you to take those, clean it up, and aggregate them into bigger codes, right? They might not be very beneficial on their own. That's when you're aggregating them. So this is just a way for you to be able to say, I coded decline once. I would look at this and I would say, is that a beneficial code if it's coded once? Probably not. And this person seemed to have decided, let's group that into another category. Now what we can do here, we have this coded for all data and memos, what we might want to do is say, I don't really care about everything. I just want to know what's in the interviews. So I'm just going to look at this in the interviews. So we're taking a subset of our data. Now we're looking at all that coding that we just looked at, but now we're looking at that only in regards to the interviews. And Michelle, this is why this is like beneficial sometimes for kind of planning down the road, is because if you put all this work and time up front, if you have multiple different pieces of data, you might say, I'm going to write a research paper, but I'm only going to focus on the interview data. You could pull up just your interview data here. And you don't have to start a whole new project. It's all here, it's all coded. You're just looking at just one part of it. You can play around with other tools. It shows you different ways to visualize this data. Or you can look at it kind of, pulling up a report about all of the different codes and references. That's really no different than looking at some of these numbers that we were looking at up here, right?
So Joe, can I jump in for a quick question?
Sure, of course.
So I've got existing interviews done, and
Sure.
then I was going to re-interview my subjects when school started. So they're going to be kind of different results. And then I want to look at everything together, how different it was pre and then after. How would I do that?
Yeah, so
Do I
there's
just add them to the.
Yeah, so there's two ways to do this. The first one is to, so here's all of our interviews again, right? The first thing that you could do is kind of create another subset over here in the data, right? You could say pre-interview and post-interview, for lack of a better term. The other thing you can do is code it as a case. You can create a case that's pre-interview and post-interview. And that's basically another way of just being able to organize the data. It essentially codes cases is just another way of coding. All you're doing is you're kind of coding the entire document as pre or post, right? So you would be able to have two categories here. One case would be pre-interview, one case would be post-interview. When you clicked on that, that's going to give you like all of those different, all the different pieces of data that would show up.
So I can create separate cases,
Mhm.
which includes both of them, and then I can look at and just, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, that's one way to do it. I mean, the other way to do it, let's see, is it person? Yeah, that's how I would do it. I wouldn't use this as a sample for how to do that, but what I would do it is I would take your interviews. If this is Barbara, and then you had one that was like Barbara 2 for Barbara's other one, I would essentially take this and I would code this whole thing here, and to new case. So code the file to new case, and I would add that new case as interview 1, right? So that's going to pop up down here in cases eventually, somewhere, I think. I am not sure. I'd have to go back. I might have done it wrong, but
I guess the question is, when I do these lovely graphs, I'll be able to look at these two pre and post side by side. And
yes, you can. You could do a comparison.
Yeah.
You could definitely do a comparison to see responses that are different. I'm going to show you another pretty cool tool to use and explore as well. You could do cross-tabbing and coding comparisons. I'm not sure how this one works. Let me double check it. Files and extensions, select items. So you could go through and you could select, let's go with interviews. Let's pick Barbara's interview versus Margaret's interview. And let's look at all codes. Yeah, let's these users or groups. Okay. Coding comparison is meant for like intercoder reliability. So it's not going to work on what I try to make it do. But what that does is basically, Michelle, if you go through and you code it and you're like, I'm going to have Priscilla code everything too to see how similar we are. You would be coding it on your computer or under your name. She would be doing it on her name. You would use coding comparison to compare both of you. So you would end up with a statistical number that would show you how close or far you are apart. So, you know, most people are like, I got 90% coding reliability. That's going to be based on a number here. And there's many different ways to look at that number, but it makes it really easy to calculate that as opposed to doing it by hand, which again is fine for data sets as well. Matrix coding is my all-time favorite tool in NVivo. So that's under next to queries, you'll see matrix coding. And this is where you would maybe do kind of what you're talking about, Michelle. So one of the ways you could do it. So what I might do here is take rows. I'm going to select items, and I am going to select cases, people, interview, study participants, right? So I'm going to, again, let's actually, I might want to do Barbara, Betty, Charles, Dan. I'm just going to pick a whole bunch of them. It doesn't really matter who. This is just for demonstration purposes. We're going to select those. All right, so these could be all of your people, or you could do this based on pre and post, however you want. Like you could pick all of those people on pre and post. Now we're going to select items. We're going to do codes, and we're going to, where is this? No, that's not what I want. Let's see. No, that's not what I want. All right, that's not the one that I want. Let's go over here to columns. Here we go, select items. Where's all of our codes? There we go. All right, I'm going to select all of our codes, right? I'm just interested in all of them. So we select it. So what this is going to do is create a matrix between all of these participants and all of our codes. You could pick just certain codes if you want, right? You could pick just certain participants. For you, Michelle, you could pick Barbara 1 and Barbara 2. Doesn't matter. We're going to run that query. Let's run it here. And the magic that exists in NVivo pops up and gives you a matrix that gives you all the different people with how many of the different codes they have, right? So you can look and you can say, all right, Barbara versus Betty. Barbara talked about economy 6 times. Betty talked about economy 1 time, right? So if you had Barbara 1 and Barbara 2, again, that would be able to show it to you. So I use this one extensively, especially if I was comparing schools, if I was comparing teachers, you know, I was always looking at this because this was what was giving me kind of the most. Now, the cool thing about this is, let's say out of all my data, I really care about the economy, but I really remember there's something that Daniel says about economy. Maybe not Daniel, let's talk about this guy. I don't know who that is, but he has 6, right? I can click on this and it's going to give me the 6 instances that are both from Charles and that are coded as economy. And we could see this is from an interview. So it's going to give us that interview. It might also have something else in here. So if you have 2 interviews, it's going to give us 2 interviews, the 2 different data sets if you're looking for both of those. So looking at that matrix code, that's how we can kind of start to now going from our broader themes to kind of narrow into where is that diversity within our data set. It doesn't have to be people. Another really cool thing to do here is to clear this, we'll just subtract everything. We might want to look at our codes. And let's just look at economy, nature, policy, make sure that's all, yeah, okay. Nature, policy, we don't want this one. So let's just take these 4, we select them. They're selecting all the little codes under that as well. We're going to do the same thing over here for codes, and I'm going to select those same exact ones. So let me get rid of all of these first. and economy. I think I had infrastructure. I'm going to select those. So I pick the same things, just like you would do a correlation matrix. I'm going to run the query. It's going to take a while because now what it's doing is rather than doing all the people and all those codes, now it's doing every code for every code, right? So we're actually now looking for where are those connections between two different themes. And this could be something that might be very beneficial. Of course, I probably should have been smarter when I pushed this button and not picked the most massive data set in there, but
Dr.
you win
Cho,
some
may
and
I
you lose.
ask a question?
Sure, while the computer's thinking, ask all the
Yeah.
questions.
Why do you do the row and the columns are the same?
For this one, it was just like trying to essentially create a correlation matrix. So you don't have to have them the same. I did them the same just to demonstrate because I thought it was going to be easy.
Oh.
But you know, it might show you, one of the ways I use this in my dissertation was I realized that two themes were kind of really highly correlated. Pretty much every time I coded something as one thing, I coded it the other thing. And I said, gee, maybe these aren't really two different codes. Maybe it's the same, or maybe it's not two different themes. Maybe it's the same theme. And so I went back through and I collapsed those together and then kind of recalculated everything. So what this is kind of showing us here is if we look at like economy, obviously economy is going to be coded as economy every single time. That's a given. But we might want to know how much is economy framed with like mixed or positive, right? So this is just a correlation matrix. If you look across economy going this way, you're going to have the same things if you go down economy looking this way. It's going to be the same numbers. Because what it's showing is how many times do we see negative codes occurring with economy. That's what we're gonna find 110 times that those two are coded together. So if we click on that, what we will see when we come here is that in Barbara's interview, we have one reference that's coded as both negative and economy. Okay, so we see kind of that sense here, something about dying option. I don't remember this being sense of doom. It's negative. It's also economy. We can look at that with the coding stripes on the side. Ooh, and we can see there's those two codes, economy and negative, popping up in the same part of Barbara's interview. We could also see there's a bunch of other stuff too that was coded. So when you go through and you do your coding, you're coding your data multiple times, at least once for every theme. So after you've done your first level coding, and this is part of the difference between sometimes doing things by hand and doing things in the computer, is that once you've done everything once, you really want to go through and do it all over again for each theme to refine your coding. It takes an extra step in there, but what happens when you do that is you're now able to say, I want to go up to Betty's interview and I want to see that part that was coded as both economy and negative. And what that tells you is now you're seeing this interrelationship between two different themes. And if we look at that on that kind of correlation matrix, if we have 233 times that the economy is talked about total, and 110 of those are also coded as negative, that kind of tells you a little bit of the sense of what your data is showing you. And you might want to start thinking along the lines of something's going on in my data set that every time the economy is being, like, not every time, but almost half of the times that the economy is being talked about, it's being talked about also in this kind of negative sense here. So we know that by looking across. Now you don't have to include all of these different themes, but that's how you would use something like Shirley, when you ask why would you have them in both columns and rows, it's simply to show a correlation matrix to help you identify some of the different features of your data. But I usually use the coding matrix to look for things like how many times do my participants talk about something, right? So I usually would put something like participants down the left side and the codes along the top and start to look for those interactions there, if that makes sense. A few last things before we kind of just jump into more workshop questioning stuff. I do want to follow up on some of these other features that we have, like word frequency. The word frequency, obviously, if you put a 2 here, it's going to show us every little its and ums and whatever. We could say we're only interested in words that are 5 letters longer. And instead of just having a word that's an exact match, we might include stemmed words. And I don't really care about 1,000. Let's just pick 200, right? And what I'm going to do is run a query. So what this is telling me is the 200 most common 5-letter words. Again, whether this is useful or not for you is going to completely be about your data set, but this could be something that might be helpful in getting a basic level understanding of what we're seeing here. We're seeing that, all right, beach is used 332 times. Turtle also a whole bunch of times. Nests, change, water, shorelines. It's just giving us a sense. But we know, you know what? There's something really interesting if beach is the most common word, right? So you might want to say, you know what? I don't really care about all the data. I really only want to know what's going on in the interviews. So let's select that and let's run this again. Maybe people aren't talking about beaches as much, but maybe we had news articles that talked a lot about beaches. So we don't want to include those in here. So let's see if we really are still interested in beaches if we look at just those words. And what we see is a very different picture, right? If we focus just on what's happening in interviews, people in this thinking, this kind of stuff is happening a lot. All right, that's interesting. Let's look at that. Barbara talked about people. This almost in a sense auto codes the data. Barbara talked about people 11 times. Margaret 23 times. Let's dig in. All right, where are we seeing this, right? And we can start to go down here and see when Barbara's talking about people. Again, all this is doing is just giving us a way to explore our data and think about that data. You can actually, there's a way in here, you would have to play around with it, but if there's a word that's really important in your study, maybe you're doing a study on self-efficacy or confidence, right? And you're doing interviews with teachers. Maybe every time that they say, oh, that student is really confident, you can code that automatically. There's a way to kind of do auto coding for that specific word. You just have to be, double check and make sure that it's okay. You could do that through text searching as well. Let's type that in. Let's go back to people. We already know that people happens a lot here. Actually, that's probably too much. Let's go to one that's a little bit less. Something more manageable than like 150. House. Let's just pick house. We're going to include stemmed words, so that includes houses or housing. And we're going to look at that in just the interviews. Data, interviews, select, and we're going to run this query. All right, we can see that Barbara talks about houses 3 times, Susan 12 times. I guess that's interesting. We could look at the context. So when people can't build the house, the fish houses have largely closed. Quite a few more fish houses. Okay, we're not talking about the same houses here, right? So something's going on in our data. Okay, we need to figure this out more. Let's look at the word tree. Interesting. Out of all of these instances of houses, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that are talking about fish houses. I've never heard of a fish house. I saw in Nemo, they like live in the anemone, however you say that word, right? I don't know anything about fish houses. Clearly something's going on in a coastal town that's about fish houses, right? And so this is contextual information that I never had. And until I pulled this up right now, I never would have even thought to say, if I'm talking about the economy, I'm talking about change, I'm talking about the environment, maybe I should be asking specifically about fish houses. And you might not know that until you get into your data and you start playing around with it, especially if you're slightly more unfamiliar with your topic. If you're working with teachers and you maybe don't have the same cultural capital as those teachers, So maybe you're working with high school and you've never worked in high school before. Picking a word that talks about, that's talking about development, for example, might be very different for a high school teacher. And you can kind of look at some of the grammatical context to see really quickly, all right, what the high school teachers mean about development might be different than what a preschool teacher means about development, right? And so you can start to infer some of those things by looking at these word trees. And again, this is all stuff that you do through that kind of searching and querying and building out and burning these things out. So now this person did say scallop houses. So I don't know if that's related to fish houses, but if you wanted to recode this data and say, I need to split this into two different things, what we can do is we can go back to our codes. Oh, actually, we didn't code houses, never mind. You could actually code all of this automatically. And then you can split those up into two different codes. One that's focused on, say, housing, one that's focused on something else. So, all right, that was a whole lot of stuff that I threw at you, but those are some of the features that I think are, for me, the most beneficial for the types of projects that you're working on and how you might use them, say, in the context of an interview study. And we could go through some of these even more, but the thing to know about the software is that it does take a lot of upfront work to make sure that you put in those codes well and that you name files properly and that everything's clean and how you want it. But once you do that, you can keep clicking and pushing buttons and getting back to the data a lot quicker and a lot more efficiently than you can by hand. And so it is a lot of upfront work. And as Dr. Bajor and I both said, sometimes it's not worth it to do all that upfront work on the computer if it's not going to be beneficial on the back end to have a bunch of these features to do like the searching and critiquing of the data. So it really is up to you and up to your way of working and your style and also the project that you're on. So I'm going to, I think, stop talking because I think
Excuse me, Dr. Joe, please wait a second.
Mhm.
What does this picture help us? Because I don't understand what does it mean. For example, here we can see house and then fish and then there was 7 or 8. What does it mean?
Good.
How can we use this picture?
Sure. So what this is doing, what this represents, and that's a good question because I kind of skipped over it pretty quickly here. So what this represents is, I can't remember how many times, well, let's go here, summary. So here's all the times the word house or houses or any of that is used, right? In the interviews. All right, so if we added that up, we would get a better idea. If we click on the reference, what we'll be able to see is when people can't build the house on their land. Seafood for us, the fish houses have largely closed. Quite a few more fish houses and places sell, right? So it's just giving us context, just a snippet. And by the way, you can change how much context these references give you. This just happens to be a few words on each side. When we go to the word tree, what this is doing is saying a history of all the houses, right? So if we click on this here, it'll show the line. So this is basically this picture, or I mean the reference list turned into a tree. So a history of all the houses that were standing there. Click on this one. All of the 3-story houses that they are putting up. The way that this is helpful when we organize it is that we can say, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different times we see house preceded by the word fish. And so what we can do is we can then go through and say, okay, well, this is interesting because out of all these times houses that are being talked about, 8 of them are not just houses as in where a person lives. They're actually talking about a fish house, which would be kind of like a, I don't know, is that where you buy fish? Does anybody know? I really don't know. Somebody help me out. What's a fish house? Nobody knows?
No, isn't it where you buy, where you can go in and buy and like a fish market, fish house?
Okay, that's what
Right.
I didn't know if it was a fish
Right,
house
yeah.
or a restaurant. But.
From reading the rest of the context, you can kind of figure out that it is, yeah, exactly what Sheila said, like a fish market, place to sell fish.
Cool. So we're looking at market. So what that's telling us is that if we look at just this word house, houses, that minimally we'd have to do a little bit more reading in here, but you know, 8 of those times it's talking about not a domicile to live in, but a place where you're selling fish. How that's helpful is it just shows us that there might be a sub theme going on or whatever. I use this a lot when I'm looking at doing discourse analysis, as Dr. Bajor mentioned last week, when I'm looking at, say, passive versus active voice, or is something the subject or the verb. I'll look at this. If something's modified, is it, I look at the grammar. I do a lot of grammatical studies of the word. So, you know, I'm looking at on a more technical level. And so it's useful for me for that purpose. For here, it's more giving you the context. And again, you can change that context from 5 words to 6 words, which doesn't really, you know, isn't so helpful, but maybe we are really interested to see the difference of, you know, the fishes. So here's, you know, 8 different times that fish precedes house. The rest of them, dark is 4 times, story is 3 times, so story house is, you know, 3, right? So it's just a way to, again, visualize what's in your data, and you can type in any word here. We can go back to beach if we wanted to, and run the query. Just again, it's just going to show us what's going on with the beach. What we see is Myrtle Beach 1 time, Atlantic Beach is about 4 times, Carolina, so specific places. Just a way to kind of organize that data.
So Dr. Joe,
Mhm.
can we make a sentence by this one? For example, when I click Atlantic, and then how can we use this one? Make sentence,
Sure.
or what else?
Yeah, so if we click on Atlantic, I'm not sure if it's going to show. It shows us the maybe if I click on this one, you know. Yeah, I guess it does. It's not going to, I mean, it'll show us where that is found, but here it's not going to bring us directly to it. But it does say the one on Dorothy. We could always come over here and look for, okay, when did Dorothy talk about it? You know, we could find that and go to Dorothy's interviews if we wanted to. So it does tell us where that comes from. We just have to go do a little bit of digging. I don't think this particular feature lets you just click on it and bring you to it.
Oh.
But what we could do
Only,
is
and
we could
then
change
it will
this
bring
to-
you to the original reference, right?
Yeah, so we could type in fish house, right? So we know based on what we just looked at, this happens 8 times, we become interested, we start going down our little like rabbit trail. I had a professor once who told us that, like, he's like, you know, everybody thinks I always go down these rabbit trails, but one day I will find a horse. And I was like, oh, I like that. So I don't care about going down rabbit trails because you never know what you're going to find. But there we go. So fish house, let's do exact match. Oh, let's give us more context here. Anyway, I'm just trying to click on, you know, play around with this and try to figure out if we can, how we can find that stuff on the fish house. But anyway, fish houses probably would be better. Let's run the query. So there you go. Now you can find these more specific examples of just the fish houses, and it'll tell you this is from Barbara's interview, Robert's interview, and so on. Again, I use this a lot for discourse purposes, because here, if it's saying the fish houses, probably it's using this as a subject. There are 7 or 8, there's no fish houses. I mean, these are all using that as kind of a subject as opposed to, you know, maybe seeing it in a different grammatical part of speech, you know. Again, just a tool that can be used for some people for some purposes, but not for everybody. All right, Jessica, Sheila, how are we doing? What's what would you like next?
Very well, Dr. J.
like, if you want, I could show, we could talk about more features, or should we, or did you just want to talk as a group and try to talk about specific things that you're trying to do? I know, Michelle, you mentioned a few things. We can, we could walk through it on this data set or with yours, whatever's going to be beneficial, and kind of tell me what you're trying to do, and we can try to figure out a way to do it.
Well, I just had and this might be a really dumb question, but I still don't have the answer as to what it can do. You said you mentioned about automatic
Coding.
I mean,
okay.
Don't we have software that can do this for us?
So there is a way to do automatic coding. I think Dr. Bajor mentioned this the other day, that it doesn't code the data for you, and that's partially, that is true. I mean, that is in the sense of qualitative thinking, it does not code it for you. What it can do is help you with certain things. So what you can do, for example, is type in, let's do a text search again for houses.
I mean, every time I, type anything on Facebook, somebody's coding me, right?
Yeah, I mean,
why is this one so difficult?
So the reason is, and there is a button here, I just have to remember where the button is. That's part of the reason. You can take this and you can code it. I think you can go to save results as a new code, right? And so you can call this houses, save results, and then you've just coded it as houses, right? In the technical sense of the word, it will populate somewhere when we go to codes now. Like if we go down to somewhere here, it should have us as codes. I don't know where. But let me get out of some of this stuff here. But this is basically what you just said, right? This basically saved it as a coding sheet. I'm not sure how to get it over here. You might have to play around a little bit with that, because it did auto-coded responses. Anyway, somewhere around here. Anyway, that's one way to go about the coding process. And now you could do the same thing, look at all of these different things just like you would with any of the codes. That's one approach to it. The other approach is that you can go to create, I think you do code. Maybe it's under explore. I don't use the auto coding option because at the time when I was using NVivo, it was not a good system. It wasn't helpful. They didn't really have a good way to do it. So I'd have to go back and look at.
Exactly. I don't recommend auto coding because I have tried once and then it said 100% code, and which I don't like that because that's what I want.
Yeah, it's not so it can't, here's how the auto coding works. I'll show you like the picture of it, right? When these programs talk about auto coding, right, this actually doesn't have any data in it. That's interesting. So here's how the auto coding works. What this does is went through the interview, and it noticed that when we look at those interviews, let me go, see, I keep deleting all this stuff because otherwise it's gonna crash my computer, and if it does, I'm out for the day, everybody. Okay, let me go back to those interviews. Let's pick up Charles just as an example here. Look at how they formatted the text here. The text is all a level 1 heading, Q period, 1 period, connection to Down East. If we look at Barbara, it's the same thing, Q period, 1 period, connection to Down East, right? So Michelle, maybe you have your different interview questions or different sections. You're going to ask that code. Now, obviously, what you exactly say might be different. Your actual words might be different. Barbara's words are going to be different too. So now what we can do is we can ask the computer, and there's a button to do this. You might have to, I'm not sure if I'm going to find it right now. You can essentially click on this and it'll auto code every question 1. So every time it sees Q period, 1 period, connection to down east, it's going to code it, and it's going to code that section. You're going to tell it how much to code, because it's going to stop coding as soon as it sees Q period, 2 period in the same font, in the same heading. So auto coding kind of is a way to help automatically input everything here organizationally, but it's not necessarily coding a theme, right? It's not doing that level coding for you, but it's coding your data in a way that you can then say, for example, let's go to the matrix code again, and let's look at all the times in question 1, these things were said, right? So that would be one example.
Well, that does seem useful with multiple interviews with the same questions, right?
Yeah, right. Because
Yeah.
you could pull up all those questions. You could do a lot of different things. Again, for me personally, I did this in my study. I just, instead of asking it to auto code it, I just went to Charles' interview and I just literally dragged this, dragged and dropped it as like code, question 1 code. So I just did that by hand. I mean, it saves you a little bit of time, especially if you have a lot of data. But if your data is organized and kept well, sure, it does that. And similarly, the auto coding for the surveys are going to be fairly similar. If you have a survey question that asks you about commercial fishing, I don't even know what this says. Because I can't.
And then I was gonna ask you, Joe, about, you were talking about your own dissertation and the coding that you did, and then what did you discuss? What when in your results? Like, how would you get all this to?
So it depends, right? For a couple of different things. The first thing that if you're doing a case study, what you might want to do is create a case, and you might say, let's look at this. If we did a bunch of interviews, I'm trying to think of a good example.
Well, what's your example? I mean, I remember reading yours a little bit.
So here's one example. Is what I did was I created 4 different cases with 4 different teachers.
Okay.
So anytime that a teacher was talking, or anytime that I had data from a teacher's classroom, or anytime that I had a teacher turn in something, like all of this stuff was coded, say Kim. And what I did at the end was I said, you know what, I really need to include a case study in my dissertation. It's going to be just a section of my dissertation, but not the whole thing. So I said, I want every piece of data that I have about Kim. All I had to do is click on the case, and I pulled everything up for Kim. If I wanted to look at all of the codes, I could look at all of Kim's codes. So for me, one of the things that was helpful was organizing the cases among where you might do a case study. So people, places, a school, an event, stuff like this. And if you code everything that's about that, you can then say, I want to know everything about Cedar Island in my entire data set. And it's going to give you everything about Cedar Island. And now you can take this data and piece that together into the case study, because all the data is right there. Another way that this is beneficial for transforming this is to go back to those codes and say, I have so you do, again, we talked a little bit, and I know Dr. Bajor could probably talk a lot more about this than me, but a lot of strategies in coding rely on kind of that 3-step process that's traditional to grounded theory, but is used in most inductive forms of coding, where we start at the in vivo, not in vivo, but the in vivo, where in vivo steals name from coding, where we're saying, I'm going to look at ecosystem services, right? And so every time I see something that deals with ecosystem services, I'm bringing it over here. Eventually those get collapsed into natural environment as a theme or whatever, right? And we start to end up building up these into hierarchies. Again, that visualization that we had kind of at the beginning, that hierarchy chart here is something that I use a lot in my dissertation, because I wanted to know when I'm talking, like if I have a theme and that theme happens to be curriculum development, which was one of the themes, I pulled out everything that was in curriculum development. And now I had kind of subsections to those themes, and I could easily pull up that data. So I can say, okay, here's curriculum development. That's the major theme. All the little themes that all the little codes that I piece together are aggregated into that parent code. So, I clicked on you know, in this case, it would have been, you know, whatever my theme would have been. So negative, I guess. Anyway, you could pull it up over here. And you could say, so for example, this is curricular development, and I was interested in funds of knowledge, which was part of curricular development. I would pull up everything that came under funds of knowledge, and I would have all of that here, so that then you have to have a systematic way to pull those examples into your data or into your paper. So what you might do is you might say, and you should write this in your chapter 3, your method section, saying that the examples that you're using are representative codes of a theme, right? Or they are, or within a theme, you're showing kind of the maximum variation. That's another key term that we would use to be able to say that when you're choosing examples, you're choosing those that push the boundaries of the theme. So either you're showing, yeah, either you have a systematic way to choose these examples, right? The first way is saying I have a theme and I'm going to choose, and maybe you have a sub theme, whatever it is, I don't care, but your examples are going to be representative of the whole, right? So you're picking those that are most kind of closely aligned or kind of the heart of your theme. And you go through these then kind of individually and you say, all right, if I have however many references here, I'm going to pick the ones that are going to represent this theme the best. And you've already said that in your chapter 3, but you give the criteria. You're choosing those themes and you're going to obviously triangulate that, right? So you're not going to pick it all from one interview. You're going to pick these negative attitudes from multiple interviews. So you're triangulating, but you're picking that along the criteria of saying, I want kind of that representative examples, and it's going to be coming from triangulated. So it's coming from multiple different interviews. And then you can start picking, okay, what are the best ones to represent this? The other way to do that is by saying you're looking for maximum variation. So even though you have this whole thing that's negative, you might be picking, they might be negative in different ways. So you're not necessarily trying to represent the whole, instead you're trying to push the boundaries of saying, here's kind of like the full spectrum of negative attitudes that we can have. And this is where you might, you know, again, you're going to pick them from different resources, but this is where you might also try to figure out from that matrix coding. If we go to that matrix code saying, let's pick all of these negative attitudes. So we're only interested in the sub theme right now of negative attitudes. So let's go to codes. We don't want all of these right now. We only want to have negative attitudes. We already did that coding. We already know that this is going to be a section in our major theme, attitudes, heading 1. What are people's attitudes about? Blah, 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 blah. All right. Major heading, negative attitudes, or about something or other. We might select this in our, oops, that was definitely not what I wanted to do. I want to only select one thing, not all of them. Codes. Again, we don't want all of these things. This is why. There's an easier way to do this, by the way. I just don't feel like going back through and resetting it all right now. Which, click those off. We don't need balance. We don't need everything under attitudes. We don't need everything under background. We just want negative attitudes. Select, and then maybe in the column, whatever, I don't know. We'll try it again in the column section. Codes. All right, now we want attitudes and we want negative attitudes only. Select, there we go, now we got it, it's fine. We run the query. We'll give it a minute. What we're looking at is every negative attitude that we've had mixed with every other code. So obviously there's 361 negative codes. 106 of the negative codes had to do with phishing, right? That tells us that somewhere in our findings chapter, if we're talking about people's attitudes, we should probably mention negative attitudes are associated with phishing. Now we can go look at those coding stripes And if we wanted to select just those two, we can. I'm just going to click all of them. You can start to see where those connections are, and then we use those examples to write around it. I'll be right back. My computer's going to die. Somebody want to entertain everybody while I go get my plug? Thanks.
I just wanted to remind everyone that it's really important. And I think it's just, just important to bring up that you're always addressing your research questions. So no matter what, when you're making coding decisions, that's something that you have to have them front and center in front. I always tell all my mentees to please have them in front of you at all times, because you need to be addressing those questions. And another thing is, if you specified to the IRB and in your method section that you're going to read through your transcripts or just do coding a certain way, it's really important to remember to do that and to go back to that and to maintain consistency in the way you code with each participant, because that's something that can kind of change, I think, from participant to participant, because you end up doing, finding a different way of coding, but I think it's for validity purposes, it's really important to remain consistent with the way you do code. And that's why you are very specific in the way you write out your method section, so that you can always refer back to that to make sure you're doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing.
And Dr. Bajor, do you also mean to not only to connect it back to the RQs, but connect back to the the TFs? Is that just as important?
Well, yes. I mean, you want to make sure that what you said you're going to do and what you're looking for in your paper is just evident. And that's the purpose for coding. You're seeking out, you're looking at it with a magnifying glass so that you can, locate all these answers to your questions or, theories. You want to make sure that you're connecting them to something meaningful so that you can answer your questions and that you can make the story in chapter 4.
And then I could go back and see other people's, go on to the library to see, but do you want to see cute little graphs in the document, the final dissertation?
Dr. Rumenapp could also, speak to that, but I think it depends on your committee, but I think visuals are always appealing.
Okay.
Usually in qualitative write-ups, and narratives, there's not a lot of space for that because you are telling the story of the participant. However, I think that for a dissertation, it's a more formal write-up. And I think that, the committee is looking for visuals. I think it helps the reader understand what's going on. And it gives a different perspective as to how to look at the data. So I think they're definitely needed for a dissertation. Maybe for your future research, if you're going to do a narrative, then that's your own choice. But I think for a dissertation, it's to your advantage to use as many as appropriate. You don't want to overkill either, but as many as you feel would be useful to getting your point across.
But not necessarily the raw transcript.
Well, you can include that as an appendix.
Okay.
But some transcripts are, and Jessica can tell you this, 70, 80 pages long. So, so that can pose a difficulty, but that's, that's where you use your verbatim quotes. You bring those in rather than the entire transcript, because the entire transcript is not going to address your research questions.
Right.
It's specific parts, specific elements, and also for the theories. So you want to make sure that you use those strong verbatim quotes to bring the essence, to bring out the and capture the real meaning of what's going on.
Perfect.
Yeah, I would just like to bounce off that just a little bit, because I think that's absolutely the way I think about this process too. You just never know until you get into writing it though, right? And you start putting together your own thing. So you might say, 10 times different participants talked about this. Here's an example of that. And you use like a quote that might be one of those offset quotes in a paragraph. It might be a 10-line transcript. If you start getting into 20 and 30-line transcripts, you really better have to have a good reason. Right? Like you don't need that much space to get the point across, right? And that's hard to gauge. There's no right answer to that. As far as visuals, 100% agree. And I do want to share a screen with you of one of my doctoral students who just finished a couple days ago, actually from a former university, because I think her visuals were smart and actually very beneficial in helping to tell the story of her data. And it was a thematic analysis. So if you don't mind, I'll she wouldn't care because it's going to be published in a few days anyway. So you should be able to see her study right here, which is a case study on the implementation of universal design rubrics using social justice perspective of disability. So I'm just going to scroll down to her findings section because somewhere around here, you'll start to see her. So she actually did her quotes like I did mine. I always do my quotes in Courier New. That's I don't know if they're going to let you do them at St. John's, but it helps it offset it as kind of that raw data. But more importantly, when you're doing analysis, text analysis, the interesting thing is that it doesn't matter if it's an I or a W. In Courier New font, it's the same distance. If it's a period, a space, a W, an I, whereas you get the letters pushed together. So when you're doing discourse analysis, it's really helpful to kind of see and space out things in kind of a true form. In Courier New, this is a side comment, by the way, in Courier New, and that's why all of my transcripts you'll see almost ever are going to be in Courier New, because every space is the same space. It lines it up really well for transcript analysis, especially when you're like trying to show overlapping talk and stuff. Side note, here's what she did. And I thought this was really helpful. She went from her raw codes to kind of the focus category codes to her thematic code and then the emergent theme, right? And she did this for each of her findings. And I'll show you another one just so you can see kind of, it sometimes looked a little bit redundant, but as a reader who's evaluating a dissertation, I had zero questions about her methods. Her methods matched the findings. It was kind of clunky. I wouldn't want to see this necessarily in every published paper. Some of this could have been an appendix probably, but she had, here's a total of 16 different times at this particular, and she explains what all these things are, but she had a total of 16 different codes that were turned into a focused category of humanized, proactive instructor, caring instructor, responsive instructor, all were moved into the thematic code of improved experience with instructor. That was part of this broader emergent theme of experience an inclusive course environment and design that models social justice, and that became her theme that she wrote around, right? So this whole section is basically about this. She has subsections, 3 different subsections that are right here. And then once she gets into those lower levels, she doesn't have necessarily one example of each of these, but I can tell, as a reader, I can tell that under each of the subcodes, I trust her. Like I trust that when she's writing about these things are represented, and it's represented in the data. And if I have any questions, I know 23 instances. I don't know what that just did, but that's smart art. I don't want to screw anything up, but 23 instances of this subcode were here. So even if I don't see some of these things, I know that they're there. And again, I trust her because I can see that she's done that work, as opposed to somebody who's just like, oh, I have this big theme and here's some examples. She spent time and she laid it out for me as a reader, and her committee as a reader. We had 0 questions. I have had one student prior to her that walked out with 0 revisions. And actually she had 2 revisions. She had to fix a comma in APA format, which she called APA to show that I was wrong. I was very proud of her for doing that. She literally called APA to ask a question about the comma to show that I was actually incorrect. And then she had to add 1 paragraph. This is the only student that went out with no revisions. I had nothing else to say to her because I've already given her all mine, and the committee was like, I don't know what else to tell you. Like, it's all laid out here. There were no questions about her method, no questions about her process. Everything was focused on, okay, well, what are your findings? How are you going to generate those in the future? What are you going to do with them? And that's because she spent time educating us as the reader of how to read her findings section. So even if you don't read all the text, this summarizes what we're looking at and tells you where the data comes from. So in this way, I thought that the visual was very useful. Again, potentially a little bit redundant, maybe not good for like an article, but for a dissertation where you're being evaluated,
So that
it was
that left,
so clear.
sorry to interrupt, that left column was where
sorry.
in the paper you could reference?
Yeah,
Is
I
it
have to go back
R2,
to,
R some page? P, oh, it's a P.
participant 2, interview
Oh,
1.
participant 2,
So,
okay.
yeah, I would have to go back and read.
Ah,
So
okay.
this you probably wouldn't need to be this specific. I mean,
Okay.
she was a little bit extra in writing all of that stuff out. She probably could have just done total of 16, and she probably could have just put it here and put 16 codes or something like that. Maybe would have been
Yeah.
helpful. Like she went a little extra and overboard, but I wasn't going to tell her no after she did it. Like I was like, it's your dissertation. If that's helpful for you, I mean, it's again, perhaps a little bit clunky, but I would rather have clunky and trust my student 100% rather than somebody who's kind of writing and
Right.
saying, here's a theme, I'm throwing in some quotes, and I don't know how she got to those quotes. She shows me how she got those quotes.
Did she do this manually? I mean,
You know, she actually used, yeah, I don't know if she used NVivo. She used something. I don't know if it was, she actually, I could probably,
I mean, I know, oh, I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, I just, in vivo could spit out that diagram like that?
no, she would have modified it.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know if she used it. She doesn't look
Well,
like
it
she
shows
used it.
in the Word document that it's a smart, what is it, smart art you said?
Art, right, so that's.
It'll do that for you.
Yeah,
Just-
so
you
she
still have to enter the.
right. All she did was she went to like insert smart
Oh,
art.
Mhm.
Right?
Yeah.
So she went to
Okay.
this,
So she
and
knew
then,
what- she had her, okay.
but I don't know how it, you know, if she used NVivo. I mean, she was extremely meticulous, and I think actually when she started this, she was doing it very much like Jessica, like you did yours with like the. I think that's how you did yours from what you were telling me, with an Excel sheet, right? So by hand, but then you type it in an Excel sheet, which again, either way is going to get you to what you could represent here. It's just which style works best for you.
So I just wanted to add on to what Dr. Joe was saying and say that I think it's better to front load all the information and to be more meticulous in the beginning, because the most the committee could do then is just say, oh, I'm sorry, that's just too much information, take it out,
Mhm.
rather than the other way around. So you want to make sure that you provide as much information that will tell the story with clarity as possible. This way there's, if you're, you can kind of almost look at it like this, predict questions that they can ask
Mhm.
and answer the questions. And, visuals can definitely help you do that.
Excellent. That was a great example. Thank you for sharing that.
That was very good.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't do it. I mean, it was my student. She's amazing. Dr. Herzig.
And did she spend, once she got to that page, or did she, and talk about it? Was that part of
In her
defense?
defense?
Yeah.
In her defense? So I recommended to her in the defense to do it once for one of the findings. So to show, just because again, like when you're trying to convince a committee, what I recommended to her was, because this would be too much to show,
Yeah.
and it's like a lot to walk through, but I said, you know what? I really love your process. I think that it's beneficial because this is the first time I've seen somebody be so clear. I was like, if you can show a shorter one like this, and then explain to the committee, this is the process that I went through. I coded everything. This is what it was. Here's how I developed these. This is how that developed into here. This is how I got to the theme. And then I went through and I wrote up the theme. I was like, if you could do that, this works as an explanation of your analysis part of chapter 3, right? So I said, just use this rather than showing us this as the findings, show us this as the method. And then in the findings, you can focus more on, here's the main theme, here's the sub-themes, whatever examples you want to share. And you can highlight the things you're most interested in and care about because you already told us what you did. And that's the most important thing is for the, had she not done this, I would have passed it. It was good. I mean, I get it. I could read through these, but I can tell you after seeing a student do this, it's going to be a lot harder for the rest of the students because I'm like, it made it so much easier for me to read through all this stuff. In fact, I didn't even have to read through some of this stuff. I did, obviously, it's my student, but I already knew where it was going because it was reduced into a one-page. This is, and it was consistent.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that a lot of students want, sometimes if you have something like personal growth and you have like 5 participants or something like that, they try to add things from each participant in there. It's not necessary to add a quote from every person, but you definitely want to have an explanation for if you write about personal growth and you only have 1 quote from 1 person here. That would be something that would be, if I was reading this, I would be like, why is it that you've only cited Katie as an example for personal growth? I was like, you might need more. However, with this particular student, if I had that question, I wouldn't be concerned because I would say, oh, you have 3 different participants that talked about it, right? So again, it was, she did her work so that it stopped me from having to ever be concerned about it. There were things that I made recommendations on earlier about saying, okay, I like this part, but I really do think you should add in a counterexample like Rachel or something like that. Give us some more context, give us another example. And she did, she had them in there, but I never doubted whether or not that existed because she already showed me, right? So, so that's kind of the give and take. There's no right way, wrong way. Like I said, this is 260 pages. I was like, that's a little bit long, but my biggest rule of thumb is that it should never be longer than your advisor's dissertation. Mine was 250 pages, so it was less than that. So what am I going to say? But, it was long, but it wasn't tedious, and part of that's because she did a really good job of reducing the data down and reminding you, right? Imagine not having these pictures or these diagrams, right? And
well, along that vein, for the proposal, we used, what did we use? Not PowerPoint. Yeah, PowerPoint, right? Is that used as well for the dissertation defense?
Yep.
Since we're all online. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's usually what's used, but like honestly, our field, or at least our field, is a little bit different than some fields. Some fields care much more about the presentation than the paper. I read through the paper and I want, that's what really matters to me. So for me, the defense itself isn't so much about your presentation. That's important, but I already read the paper.
Right.
So I want to ask questions about the paper. That's just me and my philosophy, and tends to be what's in our field. Some fields are very heavy on the dissertation or on the defense part, where you might have an hour-long dissertation. Nobody's read your paper. They don't care about your paper. It depends. It does depend on the field, but you can also see my comments in here. What did I say?
Well, you're on my committee, Dr. Joe, so.
Take note.
Is it going to be you like the PowerPoint presentation? How many slides?
Yeah, I mean, beneficial. I mean, honestly, I would rather you do a 20 to 30 minute presentation and be really quick so we can ask you questions about, okay, what does this mean?
Okay.
What is the importance of this? Like you already told us your method in chapter 3, in the proposal, and we said, go for it.
Yeah.
If that's what you're going to do it, and we'll approve this later. If you follow what we told you to do, and you follow through the data collection the way that we told you to do it, and you follow through the analysis similar to the way you did it, you're going to have to learn, obviously. That's the whole point of this process. But if you do that analysis in a methodological way, as we've been talking about today, as Dr. Bajor and I both said, if you're writing that out, explaining to us your method, then it's really easy for us to give that stamp of approval. The thing that I care about is, what does this mean? Now I've moved, right? And I should be, by the time you get to your defense, I would prefer it if you moved beyond, I'm the dissertator, to I'm the researcher that's translating this into meaning, right? And this is a big difference here, because in the dissertation phase, in the writing, you're understanding it, you're thinking about it, you're putting it into paper, you're developing that knowledge and analyzing that meaning. But what I really care about is that you're able to translate that into real beneficial action and meaning at the end of it. So give me your 20 to 30 minute spiel, that I read the 200-page paper. I know what you said. What I want to know is, can you explain to me why this matters? That's just my preference. I'm going to test you and check to make sure that you understand what you're doing. But if that was in the paper, I don't need to sit here and dwell on whether or not you coded things once or twice. Tell me you did it in the presentation. If I have questions, I'm on your committee. And if I'm on your committee, I would have already told your chair I have concerns or questions. You better get this fixed before I get to the defense, right?
Okay.
So I always would rather read it before it gets up for the defense, so that I know I'm not worrying about your coding. You already told me what you did, right? If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Everybody's different. Some people wait till like the last minute. I know that when I was, I sat on a committee with Dr. Bajor where I came in kind of at the last minute, Paulo's, right? And I didn't have the time to do all the back and forth and stuff. And so it was helpful for me to hear his, much longer dissertation defense, but that's because I had only read the paper once and hadn't gone back and forth with things. I wasn't really concerned. Dr. Bajor did an excellent job, chairing that committee, but in those situations, I would be much more critical of what's coming up for defense. But in a situation like yours, where I've kind of been with you, like I will read your paper multiple times probably before you get to defense.
Okay. Okay.
Now, there's a lot of students, and I've had 2 in the past year, that have said that, no, I'm sorry, Dr. Rumenapp, I want to do a longer presentation. I said, we don't need to. Give me a good reason. But it was for good reasons. And one of them was, she was very clear. She's like, listen, she's like, I am a Colombian woman. I am a woman of color. She's like, my family's going to be there. My other colleagues are going to be there. And she's like, it's important for me to address all questions and concerns about my study, because I want people to see that me as a bilingual Colombian woman can do this job. And I was like, you're absolutely right. This is your defense. If you have a good reason to do, you don't need to do it for me, right? So for her, she asked and asked and asked, and finally I just was like, fine, you can do a 40-minute presentation, because it was important for her to share. And this is the part that got me the most, was that she wanted to share her story. She was like, it's important for me to share my story because my research is about bilingual students. I myself am bilingual. I need to share my story. And I was like, if that's the case, have an hour, have 2 hours. I don't care, right? But if you don't have a good reason, you don't need to have a 40-minute defense. So again, that's just my opinion. I tend to be a little bit more loose on things.
So Dr. Cho, do you mean that the proposal and the defense, they're all about half an hour, right?
So in general, the way that I've run mine and have seen it, and what many of us on faculty in the literacy program estimate, is that the proposal defense should be about 15 to 20 minutes.
Oh.
It could be 20 to 30. I mean, somewhere around there. With the dissertation defense being 30 to 40 minutes max. It could even be a little bit less. That's again a general rule of thumb. Everybody has their own opinions. Dr. Blake, Sheila, you know this because you said on some of your colleagues, they just kept going, and I was like, I got to go to bed because they were like moving in on like an hour and a half. So again, everybody's different. My recommendation is, for the proposal, generally 20 to 30 max, and 30 to 40 for the other one. Okay. Again, max.
So would you please tell me what contents should we put on the proposal?
Yeah, so again, a little bit to back up a little bit, my reasoning for that is in part because we're trying to socialize you into how to become researchers. So I base that off of the fact that if you go and present this to a scholarly community as a doctoral student or as a PhD holder, no matter what you do, when you walk into the Literacy Research Association or American Educational Research Association, you need to break down your ideas in a study down to 15 to 20 minutes. And sometimes you get there and the chair of the presentation is like, you only have 12 minutes, and you're like, oh shoot, what do I get rid of? So you have to think on your toes. So the more you can get into condensing your information in a meaningful way through visuals, through examples, through, whatever, the better off you are. So the first thing you should always do, in my opinion, and again, Dr. Bajor, you've been doing this pretty much as long as I have, right? So like maybe longer, I don't remember when you started. So the point is that you can,
I mean, do I need to do the introduction section and the literature review and methodology
briefly,
in the proposal?
In the dissertation or the proposal?
No, I know that there were 5 parts in dissertation, right?
Yeah. Mhm.
And then I mean that when we do the dissertation, we need the findings and then discussion. But when we do the proposal, we do the first 3 parts, right?
Yeah. So for the proposal, I generally recommend that somebody comes in with the introduction and really sell the committee on why this is important and needs to be studied. Give us the reasons behind. If you need to tie that a little bit to, your personal background or emotions, that's fine. But I mean, the biggest thing is that you're able to lay out a really good reason in your defense of why we should care.
Hi,
Like, tell us
Doctor.
why we should care.
I'm sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
Like we're getting a little off the topic.
Yeah. Okay.
And I know that all the advisors and the chairs, they do a really good job in explaining the dissertation and the proposals to students. But because time is running out and I don't know when it's going to cut off, I don't know if anyone else has any questions regarding the software or collecting qualitative data, or if Jessica just want to give a short spiel about doing it by hand, her issues with hand, as opposed to the software. Or
Yeah.
break, I don't know.
Yeah. Yeah, Shirley, just go ahead and ask your advisor for what their previous people have done, and they should be able to give you a template of the PowerPoint so you can kind of see what they think is important. But yeah, I think that's a good transition into Jessica. Your turn to shine.
Yeah, and just Shirley, there were PowerPoints posted in our Canvas page, so that was helpful too. So your program might even have something accessible to all of your you and your colleagues, your peers, that might be helpful. But really all I noticed is just that it was intuitive. I thought that this program had so much potential, but I didn't have enough time to fully grapple with it. It feels like a lot. It feels a little intimidating to me, but having done a lot of the organization on Excel, I felt like Excel it had the capabilities to move around things, to copy and paste things, to hold my data in a way that feels visually accessible and organized, but it took a lot of work. So it took so much cutting and pasting to get all of my items into columns, into rows, into a way that I felt like I could visit it and then create my narratives and construct my narratives by revisiting each of those spreadsheets. So I think that one of the benefits of something like NVivo is that you can push a few buttons and it'll do it more quickly for you. But that doesn't mean that you can't do it in Excel. It's just that with Excel, you have to conceptualize, or at least I did. I had to think about and conceptualize, how can I organize this data to make sense, to make meaningful sense to me, so that I can view it and retrieve it when I'm writing and when I go into my analytic discussions. So one thing that I found to be somewhat validating is that in NVivo, it had this functionality where you could get the code and then all of the instances of the code after that. That's basically what I did in Excel. So for each of my codes, I had a sheet where I had the code itself followed by a descriptor as to what that code entailed, meaning what criteria was I using to find text that went with that particular code. Then I copied and pasted all of my instances into that, separated by each of the 3 participants. So my study is a narrative. I only have 3 participants, but I did, as Dr. Bajor stated, accrue a lot of data. So by column, I had the 3 different participants by the code, and I was able to see all of the instances in which that code appeared. In NVivo, I could push the button and it pulled that up. Is that making sense so far? So it felt a little more like it took out some of the legwork from the copying and pasting component. And then furthermore, I also developed spreadsheets to do my categorizing. So once all of the codes were together, then I started grouping codes into categories. And again, this was an entirely different spreadsheet. So one thing that I did like about NVivo is how everything is in one place. I have multiple spreadsheets that are on my desktop, multiple documents such as the memoing that are in another folder. With NVivo, it was all there. It was all streamlined into one particular packet of information. Now, I personally know where all of my organizational stuff is because I've worked to try to, really be clear, use very clear wording on my files and consistent wording on my files. But at the same time, it was nice to see how in vivo had everything all in one place. And then one thing that I did find to be helpful, that I don't know if any of you have seen this, but if you haven't, I think the Saldana text, or yeah, the Saldana book speaks to it, is I created a code book. So as I mentioned before, each of the codes had a descriptor that I gave to it. And in vivo, it allowed you to do that as well. I just did it manually. But then I've created a document where I have all of my codes with all of their descriptors and exemplar quotations from at least 2 of the participants, showing what kind of coded segment exemplifies that particular code. That way, as I was coding, I could refer back to the code book to make sure that I was being accurate. And then this code book will be a resource that can be put as an appendix at the end of the dissertation to show the reader that I had, as Dr. Rumenapp was saying, a little bit more of a strategic way of approaching my coding, so that if there are any questions about, well, why did you code it this way? I can refer back to the code book and say, well, this particular code signifies perspectives and beliefs about X, Y, Z. And then it matches up that way. And again, all of this was done in Excel. And I just had to kind of put on my creative thinking cap in terms of how will this work for me? But then also the code book is how will this work for the reader to see what my thinking process was, if that makes sense. So I don't know if that helps.
Yes, thank you so much.
Yes, it's
for that.
very helpful. Thank you.
And
And then
found
I
it
have
in the
one
book.
question on how to do the corrective coding. I mean that I want to code with another person and to compare our coding, how to do that in vivo.
Sure, yeah, real quick. I think this is, we're probably gonna have to leave in a few minutes here, but I think this is a really good point, Shirley, because a lot of studies do require intercoder reliability or they're bigger projects. There's a couple of different ways. NVivo does have a collaborative tool where you can work on multiple computers and almost like a cloud version. But what you can do, and let me see if I can find it on my NVivo screen real quick, is that you're going to be coded in as a user. So the tricky part here is file sharing, but let's just say you have the file on a central computer in a lab, for example. What you do when you come into it is you're going to somehow essentially write down, there's a section on here about who you are, and I can't remember where that button is now in this new one, but you're going to be the user. So when I code something, it codes it as JCR, right? It automatically is going to code it from me. And you do that when you set up NVivo. So when you downloaded it and you had to write your name in there, it asks for your initials. Those initials will pop up. What you can do then when you're doing the comparative stuff is under queries and the coding comparison. So here's your user group, A, user group B, or whatever. This is where you would be able to select the users. And that will populate when you have more than one user programmed in here. Right now I have it only set up for one user, that's me. So you just have to figure out, and you can probably Google it faster than I can show you, because I have to look for it too. There's a place in here to add users. And then you just make sure when you log on, you're logging on under your username. And I think that happens every time you go to NVivo. Like I think if you log in or something like that, that's if you're doing it collaborative, like online. But even when you log into NVivo, you log in as the user. And yeah, so like users here, this is the only, these are fake people, right? Those are people. So if you wanted to use that, I'm sure you can find this in the, I'm sure we could probably do that here. If we do all codes with, and try to find like Wanda. Wanda was one of them, one of the people, right? So Wanda Swope, done. And we could pick user B, we could pick Effie Reeves, done. Jessica, this is a great idea to use this sample stuff. It has everything we need.
How can you put their names in your system?
Yeah, these names are already in the system. You just have to go to, you just have to create it. Again, I don't remember where the button is to create it, but somewhere in here, there's a place to add. users, but you put them in your system, and it's either on the hard drive itself, or it's going to be on it's either on the hard drive or on the cloud, depending which one you use. It's going to populate, and you just make sure you log in with your initials and the other person logs in with their initials, and then it'll be able to show you the differences here. But yeah, like I said, one of these buttons will do it. Here it is. So what this basically means is that each of these people coded it individually, right? So Wanda signed in and Wanda coded it. Effie signed in and Effie coded it separately, and it'll show you how much they agree. And you can actually, like in agriculture, they agreed like 100% of the time on these things, but not here. So you can actually like break out to see if there's a problem with the coding based on.
So
based on the
100% is the perfect, right?
Yeah, that's perfect. So you'd have to, again, dig into that and figure out, why. I don't know this data set very well. I only opened it up today. I've never seen this before, so I don't know. I'd have to look deeper into this when I'm talking about things I don't know about, but it looks like they coded the same thing 100%. So.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right.
Last minute questions, real quick for Dr. J. Any last minute comments?
I just want to thank Sheila and Jessica again for putting this together, and Dr. Rumenapp. I think it's amazing. I said it last week, but I'm so happy that our students are getting all this enrichment. And it's a wonderful experience for everyone. So thank you, everyone.
Yeah, thank you guys. I really appreciate the live connection. It's really helpful.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate that. It solved me many problems.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, and good job. Great job, Sheila and Jessica, for all of this. We'll talk next week about the videos and how to make them accessible. Or
Next week we will have the workshop too.
No, next week we'll be off. Sorry, there's a lot of noise outside. Yeah, this is the last one for now. We'll hopefully resume in a couple of weeks or when the semester starts. But yeah.
Would you please send me an email, because my manager has sent me this workshops email so that I attend it, but I don't receive any more email about other kinds of workshop about our dissertation.
Yeah, Sheila and Jessica will collect your email and we'll be able to,
Okay.
or in the
here.
sign-in page. Yep. All right, it should be in the sign-in forms, but anyway.
Yes, sign the attendance, Shirley.
Sorry?
Sign the attendance in the chat.
Okay, my name is here. My email.
All right, thank you. So yeah, we'll.
Dr. Bajor, it was an honor to have you, methods expert, to give us any little tips that you were able to provide for us.
Thank you for inviting me. It was really an honor to be here with everyone and to meet new students and to, collect, and really communicate with my old students. So not old, but my former